In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. You cannot swim for new horizons until you have the courage to lose sight of the shore. That's how the novelist William Faulkner saw the virtue of courage. And what I like so much about that particular quote is the way that Faulkner understands courage as a form of sight. Those who possess courage see things that others don't. While most only see the towers ablaze in flames from hell, the courageous few look beyond that, and what they see are humans in danger. They see the need, and then they react to that vision. But it's not normal. The conventional answer to experiencing danger is to run for safety. And yet in every society, there are those radicals. What did the iconic Apple commercial say? Here's to the crazy ones, the rebels, the troublemakers, the ones who see things differently. Even this past week, our nation remembered once again a bunch of radicals. These young men in their Higgins boats, landing in their Higgins boats at Omaha Beach, being greeted by 85 machine gun nests. They named just a few of the weaponry that was pointed in their direction, as they courageously chose to act. And because they chose to act, millions were freed from tyranny. They took bold steps. They lost sight of their own personal protection as they reached for a new horizon, one that required awesome acts of self-sacrifice. Leaving their landing craft, stepping out into danger with such odds against you. Why? Did they do it to free the millions enslaved? Did they do it for the love of country? Or was it just for the love of their brother to the right or to their left? Perhaps it was just what duty called for. Whatever the motivation, it's clear that they were animated by something that's not entirely intelligible to the normal person. To some extent or another, they looked not at what can be seen, the obvious danger, but they instead looked at what cannot be seen. Some ideal, some love, some value that compelled them to step out. It's rightly become one of the greatest symbols of 20th century national life. That very act of stepping out into that hell at Normandy. And I think it's become so symbolic of courage because mere normals like me, and perhaps mere normals like you, we can't imagine that level of courage. We only see what can be seen. Leaving war now and entering a different kind of theater, the drama of a spiritual life. St. Paul reveals to us that courage works rather similarly here. The apostle will get to courage a little bit later in his second letter to the people of Corinth, where he'll state that Christians must always possess courage, for they look at life differently. They don't just look at it, they look with the eyes of faith. Many just see the affliction, the trial, the tribulation, yet St. Paul calls us to be the crazy ones, the rebels, the troublemakers, the ones who see things differently. And the key to his thought is found right here at the heart of our epistle, read for us so beautifully just a little bit earlier. When Paul says the disciple of God looks not at what can be seen, but what it cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal. And this is what Jesus calls us to. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is on the way. And that is a key term for Mark because the whole gospel is meant to be a pathway, a laid out course that will show us what discipleship truly looks like. For Mark, everything is immediate. Jesus is always on the move, sharing his light. And so Mark is the action movie to the more dramatic Matthew and Luke, and even more so to the cerebral sort of independent film like John's Gospel. Mark is filled with action, as Jesus is always active, showing us exactly what discipleship looks like. And for Jesus, it's something that is radical. It requires seeing things differently. Not just seeing what is there to be seen, but seeing with the eyes of faith that which is eternal. And so we get this rather weird gospel story where Jesus will turn everything upside down. Just when you think that Jesus will choose the conventional, he swerves and does the unthinkable. He doesn't quite get the message to focus on the family. If only he were to live in the 20th or 21st century with all of modern church's wisdom, he would have understood that family is most important. Perhaps if Jesus would have accessed the television, he would have been much better informed. For as we all know, the best sitcoms are the ones created around the family. Family ties are the strongest bonds we have, and as we are told constantly, or at least quite frequently, by our politicians, by other people, family values are the most enduring of our ideals. There's nothing more important than family. And it's no doubt true that family is essential. And it's important to realize that Jesus is not saying something contrary to that fact. So the question has nothing to do with the importance of family. Rather, it has something to do with its place. Is there something higher than family? Or perhaps we have a better way of putting it, or asking it is there something higher than the biological family? Is that all that Jesus calls us to? To be a good father, mother, son, daughter? Or is the calling more radical than that, requiring a greater dosage of spiritual courage? Now, feeling that I already got ahead of myself, let me back up and just review the story. It begins with a very busy Jesus. It's peak time, or peak season for the ministry of Jesus, and has reached now a zenith level. And this takes place when he's home back in Capernaum, a place that is supposed to be a refuge for him. But his work follows him home. Now, this is just the reality for us who live in the modern age, where there are cell phone devices. The divide between work and home has been dissolved. That divide that is supposed to replenish and renew and revive us is now gone. And if we're not careful to set personal discipline or careful boundaries through personal discipline, it can lead to some very, very dangerous results. So if all one was to do is just merely to read this story in isolation, we might think that Jesus is a workaholic. But of course we read about the many times throughout his ministry where Jesus practiced the personal discipline of withdrawing away from the crowds and spending time with his Father, replenishing himself and his soul. But in this particular situation, Jesus answers the call and ministers to the hurting folks who are coming to him. To add stress to the situation, it's the second time that this has happened. Earlier in chapter 2, Jesus returns home, and only to encounter the pressing crowds, people who were so needful of his aid, they jammed the room that he was staying in, and no one could move around. And it's the same scene here in the latter portion of chapter 3. The pressing crowds, full of oppressed people, coming to Jesus. But instead of a room being jammed this time, it's the Spirit of Jesus. So busy that it could not even eat. And if you've ever been in that kind of situation before, you kind of know the feeling. That closing in feeling when you feel like your spirit is being slowly crushed and everything is caving in. And so his loved ones were rightly concerned. For it seemed that Jesus was losing his mind, that he was beside himself. And so thank God for the family. Because we all know how this is going to end. The family is going to sacrifice the travel to see Jesus. They're going to lecture him about boundaries. And Jesus will see the error of his ways. With soothing, sappy music playing in the background, Jesus and his family all comfortably sitting on a bed in the midst of a beautifully designed set. And he'll tell his family how they saved him and how much he really needs them and loves them. Again, if only Jesus had network television, this could have turned out much, much better. But before we get to the way that Jesus responds to his family, we get another story right in the middle of our narrative. These scribes, they don't like Jesus very, very much, arrive in Jerusalem, or from Jerusalem, in order to harass him, accusing him of being possessed by demons. But not just any demons, they go all out. Because you know the rule, if you're going to accuse somebody of demon possession, go big or go home. So they go big. They accuse Jesus of being possessed by the prince of demons, the ruler of all satanic forces. Now, if you arrived today excited to hear about Beelzebul, the parable of the straw man plundering his house, or the unpardonable sin, all the mystery of the unpardonable sin, then I'm afraid you might be disappointed, because this sermon is not that. As the stern wife said to the mischievous husband who was only looking for a hug, not today. Not today. So skipping over that middle story, we need to see how Jesus responds to his family now that they are in Capernaum. But I would be remiss if I didn't point out one quick fact about the story of these rather naughty scribes. They, like Jesus' family, see Jesus in a certain way. They have normative expectations for him. They want him to act in a certain manner. And when he doesn't, there must be something wrong with him. They seek to domesticate him, to tame him by putting a pall on the radicalness of his ministry. So let's be clear here, the scribes are 1,000,000 times worse than Jesus' family. They hate and want to destroy Jesus. But in some ways, both the scribes and the family share a commonality. They want Jesus to color within their own perceived lines. Jesus by now knows what his family thinks and why they've shown up in Capernaum. And so he chooses to act or to make this a teachable moment. So with the crowd of his followers gathered around him, he receives word that his family has arrived and are outside. And he chooses to keep them outside. With spiritual courage, Jesus doesn't cleave to that which is comfortable. He chooses that which is radical. He declares that his true family are the ones who are gathered around him, those elected to be close to him, and those daring to go out into a hostile world to do the will of God. The theme of discipleship that began in chapter 1, when Jesus asks select persons to leave their nets, to follow him, and that I will make you fisher of men, intensifies here as Jesus reveals more what that calling looks like. What does it mean to leave your nets? What does it mean to follow Jesus? It's a radical call to follow him and to form a new kind of family. Now, I want to be clear here. Jesus is not asking us to abandon our biological families, but that would be antithetical to kingdom building. Biological families are a good given to us. And we are to be faithful in those relationships, even when it causes us personal pain. Nor are we to relinquish the ideals about our biological families. Good and wholesome families are indeed the backbone of society. But what Jesus shows us here is that there's another family. One not temporary and earthly, but one that is eternal. And while having earthly benefits, will be enjoyed most fully in heaven. There's something more important than the biological family, and that is the church. While the first is formed together through blood ties, the second is forged together through a mutual love made possible through the shedding of Christ's blood. What Jesus calls us to is pictured in that scene of followers gathered around him. And this is what the church does each week as we gather around the body and blood of Christ. It's a family whose ties are eternal, whose work fulfilling God's will is everlasting. Now, Mark's gospel doesn't just tell us the story of discipleship for you and me. It also tells the story of Christ's discipleship as well. How does Jesus prove to be a worthy disciple of his Father? And there's a line that stretches from this episode all the way to Gethsemane. The key, of course, is when Jesus says that the disciple, my spiritual family member, fulfills God's will. And it's in the garden where we see Jesus calling out for his Father. Not his biological father, but his true spiritual father. He calls out for his Father, and he asks for this cup of suffering to be removed from him. But the next thing he adds is the creed of the disciple. The creed of the disciple. He says, not my will, but what you will. Now I know, I've been to theology class, I understand. Jesus is eternally the Son of God the Father. That's as true as the goodness of pumpkin pie. We understand that. But think about it in terms of the story that Mark is telling. Think about it in terms of the process of discipleship. And what we see is that Jesus really in that moment, in the garden, becomes God the Father's Son. He passes the test. But just as Jesus says, to become part of this spiritual family, you must do the will of God. To have true spiritual courage, you must lose sight of the mere temporary. With the eyes of faith, you must see something more. Something more than the average normal person sees. You must see something eternal. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.